without firing a single shot, without sending a single soldier into battle. Australia managed to wound one of the most powerful nations on Earth. This is not the story of missiles and tanks. It is the story of sanctions, trade, diplomacy, and unrelenting pressure. It is the story of how a middle power, far from Europe's front lines, became a giant in the fight against Moscow. This is how Australia broke Russia. The turning point came in 2014, high above the skies of Ukraine. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, a routine flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, was cruising at 33,000 feet. Then, in a flash, it was gone. A Russian-made Buk missile, launched from separatist-held territory in eastern Ukraine, tore through the aircraft. 298 people died instantly. Among them, 38 Australians. For Australia, this was no longer a faraway war. This was personal. The grief was overwhelming. Families were shattered. Children, parents, entire households wiped out in an instant. Across the continent, vigils burned through the night. The names of the victims were read aloud, and a nation thousands of kilometers from the battlefield now felt the brutality of Russian aggression in its bones. Prime Minister Tony Abbott was blunt. He called it an unspeakable crime and demanded accountability. But accountability never came. Moscow denied, deflected, and deceived. Russian officials launched a campaign of lies, claiming the Ukrainians were responsible, flooding the world with disinformation. Canberra wasn't fooled. Australia had seen the cost of Russian weapons firsthand. The line had been drawn. And so, long before the full-scale invasion of 2022, Australia became one of the earliest countries to sanction Russia. It wasn't just a policy decision. It was an act of justice for the lives lost aboard MH17. This was the seed. And 8 years later, it would blossom into one of the strongest anti-Russian stances outside Europe. Fast forward to February 2022. Russian tanks rolled across Ukraine's borders. Missiles struck Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol. The world watched in shock. But in Canberra, there was no hesitation. Australia joined the condemnation within hours. Some asked, why should Australia care? It was far from Europe. Its trade with Russia was relatively small. What difference could it make? But this question missed the point. Australia understood something crucial: aggression unchecked in one part of the world empowers aggression everywhere. By acting quickly, Canberra made a statement. It showed that Russia's war was not just a European problem, but a global one. And that message resonated, especially across the Indo-Pacific, where countries watch China's actions with concern. Within days, Australia banned Russian oil, gas, refined petroleum, and gold. This wasn't just symbolic. Russia's economy depends on resource exports. By cutting them off, Australia weakened one of Moscow's strongest levers of power. And more importantly, it set a precedent. If a resource-rich nation like Australia could live without Russian oil and gas, then so could others. In a single move, Canberra helped dismantle the myth of Russian energy invincibility. But Australia didn't stop at sanctions. It took another step, one that truly surprised Moscow. Weapons. Australia shipped Bushmaster armored vehicles across the world. Tough, all-terrain troop carriers built in Queensland. On the streets of Ukraine, they became more than just machines. They became symbols. Ukrainian soldiers painted murals of Bushmasters, celebrating them as lifesavers. President Volodymyr Zelensky himself thanked Australia, saying, "These vehicles will do a good job on the battlefield." Think about what this meant. A country thousands of kilometers away, with no NATO obligations, was supplying frontline equipment against one of the world's largest armies. And it didn't stop with Bushmasters. Australia sent artillery, drones, protective gear, ammunition, and humanitarian aid. By 2023, it had given over $500 million in support, making it the second largest non-NATO contributor, behind only Japan. For Russia, this was humiliation. Because Australia wasn't supposed to matter. It was supposed to be distant, uninvolved. Yet here it was, shaping the fight, one shipment at a time. The battlefield wasn't only in Ukraine. It was also in embassies, courtrooms, and television screens. In Canberra, Russian diplomats were expelled, accused of spying and acting against Australia's interests. But the bigger blow came when Moscow tried to expand its embassy compound, right next to Parliament House. Australia blocked it. The High Court intervened. The land was reclaimed. And then, in a surreal twist, a lone Russian diplomat staged a sit-in protest on the property. For weeks, he refused to leave. He became a bizarre symbol of Moscow's shrinking influence. Australia had turned diplomacy into theatre. And Moscow was the punchline. But Canberra didn't stop there. It went after Russia's disinformation machine. State-backed outlets like RT and Sputnik, which had been used globally to spread lies about Ukraine, were sanctioned and restricted. This wasn't just about silencing propaganda. It was about protecting the public from manipulation. And once again, Australia led by example, proving that information could be defended, just like territory. Sanctions weren't just lists of names. They were surgical strikes at Russia's financial arteries. When Moscow tried to use gold to bypass banking restrictions, Australia shut the door. Billions in potential revenue disappeared. When oligarchs tried to park their wealth in Sydney's real estate or Melbourne's financial accounts, Canberra froze over $200 million in assets. Luxury yachts, bank deposits, multi-million-dollar homes, all locked down. And by 2023, more than 1,000 Russian individuals and entities were sanctioned. Oligarchs, banks, defense contractors, propagandists. For a middle power, this was unprecedented. Australia was punching far above its weight. And every frozen dollar, every banned ship, every blacklisted name was another crack in Moscow's war machine. Russia's greatest weapon has always been energy. For decades, Europe depended on Russian gas pipelines. But when Moscow tried to use that dependence as blackmail, Australia became part of the solution. Liquefied natural gas exports from Darwin and Queensland surged. Most shipments went to Asia, but the global effect was clear. By feeding energy-hungry economies in the East, Australia freed up supplies for Europe. And then came the oil price cap. Australia joined the G7 in enforcing it, cutting Russia's oil profits without crashing global markets. The Kremlin raged. But numbers told the story. Billions drained from Russia's budget. At the same time, Australia's own economy thrived. Wheat exports rose as Russia's supplies faltered. Critical minerals, vital for modern technology, found new buyers who no longer trusted Moscow. Australia wasn't just punishing Russia. It was replacing it. And that's the ultimate defeat in economics, not being fought, but being made irrelevant. The war didn't just change Ukraine. It changed Australia's place in the world. Canberra deepened its ties with NATO, attending summits, expanding intelligence cooperation, and aligning its defense posture with Europe and the US. For Moscow, this was a nightmare. The Western alliance was no longer limited to the Atlantic. It now stretched into the Pacific. And when Australia sanctioned Belarus, Moscow's closest ally, the message was clear. This wasn't just about Russia. It was about everyone who stood with it. From the skies of MH17 in 2014, to the battlefields of Ukraine in 2022, to the sanctions, expulsions, and embargoes that followed. Australia showed that power is not measured only in missiles or tanks. It is measured in resolve. Without firing a single shot, Australia broke Russia's illusion of invulnerability. It proved that even a middle power, thousands of kilometers away, can change the course of history. This is the new face of global conflict. One where economics are weapons. One where distance is irrelevant. And one where Australia, steady, quiet, determined, showed that sometimes, the sharpest bullets are the ones never fired. So that was today's video, guys. See you in the next one with another interesting topic. Till then, have a great day and do subscribe and like the channel. Thank you.